1971 was a very confusing year for Pontiac buyers in Canada. Now, the first thing to note before we get into some of the details is that Pontiac was long the volume brand in Canada, not Chevrolet like in the United States. In fact, Pontiac far outsold Chevrolet for many years in Canada, and even GMC Truck outsold Chevrolet Truck. That's just how the market was. Pontiac dealers were the ones who were able to make entry points into Canada many years ago and established a broad dealer network that allowed them to have some significant sales. Now, as a result of this, Canadian Pontiacs were different from U.S. Pontiacs, in part because of the dealer network and also in part because of import duties and restrictions that were in place for many years. As a result, if you buy a Canadian-made vehicle from a time frame, let's say from the mid-1970s and before that, you'll find that many of the components on it were sourced from Canadian suppliers, and the car itself was made in Canada. So General Motors made many different vehicles at its Oshawa assembly plant, and in order to get economies of scale within the country, it used a lot of Chevrolet components on Pontiacs up until the mid-1970s. Everything from frames to brakes to engines even. So you could get a Chevrolet 350 in your Pontiac, something that you couldn't get in the United States. And that was, in fact, the case still in 1971. In fact, in 1971, Pontiac had a very confusing lineup in Canada. And that's because, well, in the U.S., there was the all-new Grand Ville, which was the range-topping Pontiac that had the more formal roofline, similar to the Olds 98 and Buick Electra. That was introduced in its first year in 1971. You had the Grand Ville, you had the Bonneville, which was now relegated to one level down. And then you had the Catalina and a Catalina Brougham at the same time in terms of full-size Pontiacs. But in Canada, you not only had those models, you also had a Parisian Brougham, which was the top-of-the-line Canadian Pontiac, and you also had the Laurentian, which for many years in Canada was the mid-level Pontiac. You had the Strato Chief below that. But by this point, the Laurentian was really the bottom-of-the-barrel, full-size Pontiac of all the Pontiacs. So in summary, you had the Grand Ville, the Bonneville, the Catalina in the U.S. in terms of full-size Pontiacs, and in Canada, you not only had those vehicles, you also had the Parisian Brougham, and you also had the Laurentian. So it was a really confusing lineup if you were a Pontiac buyer in Canada. And what was the Canadian buyer to make of this? Well, the Parisian Brougham kind of slotted into the mid-level of the lineup. It was no longer the top Pontiac. If you wanted the top Pontiac, then you got a Grand Ville. And what we're going to talk about today is this beautiful black 1971 Canadian Grand Ville. So somebody must have really wanted the top-of-the-line Pontiac, a true top-of-the-line Pontiac, and that's what they got in this case. Now, first of all, don't let that Texas license plate fool you. Take a look here at the dealer badge on this 71 Grand Ville, and you can see it says Ball McLean, Vancouver, and it's got a Cadillac logo. So perhaps this was a used car in Canada and somehow made its way to Texas. I admittedly don't know, but at some point it was changing hands up in the Vancouver area, as denoted by this dealer badge. But regardless of its provenance, this 71 Grand Ville is a rare all-black vehicle. It was super uncommon for these cars to be ordered in black. Often that was seen as like a funeral car, but I think it gives these large cars just a stately elegance. And perhaps that's why this car made it to Texas, was because the buyer of it just had to have one of these 71 Grand Villes in black. Now, this is a four-door hardtop. The Grand Villes came in two-door hardtop and four-door hardtop form. As I mentioned, this was an all-new vehicle for 1971. It used the Olds 98 and Electra roofline, rototop 126-inch wheelbase as compared to the 123.5-inch wheelbase of the Catalina, as well as the Parisian Brougham and the Laurentian. So if you got the Catalina, the Parisian Brougham, or the Laurentian, you got the smaller wheelbase. If you got the Grand Ville or the Bonneville, you got the 126-inch wheelbase. You actually got a larger car when you got a more expensive Pontiac. You can also tell that this car has some interesting options. It appears to be fully loaded, as we'll see on the inside. But on the exterior, it has cornering lights. That's a pretty rare option. I don't think I've seen another Grand Ville or 71 Pontiac with those cornering lights. They were relatively infrequently ordered, but you can see them here on this vehicle. And I love the wheel discs with the red centers that Pontiac had in this particular year. I think just sets off this black vehicle so well. Here's a rear three-quarter view of the car. And you can see that the C-pillar is relatively vertical on this Grand Ville. And again, that was because the designers wanted to give this car the formal roofline. Pontiac wanted to move up market, and they used the roof from the Olds 98 and Buick Electra to do so. This is a four-door hardtop, as I mentioned. Note there were no four-door pillared sedans when it came to these vehicles, the 1971 to 1976 GM full-sizers. They all were hardtops, whether it was a four-door hardtop or a two-door hardtop, and they have really nice flush glass. It just gives the car a refined look. And the 71s also have a somewhat restrained, but also, I would say, well-surfaced styling associated with them. Now, as we turn out back, you'll notice something interesting. If you look at the deck lid, you'll see some louvers there. Well, what the heck is that on this deck lid? Well, here you are. Here's a closer picture of those louvers, and they are indeed louvers. And no, this is not aftermarket. This was factory. This is the 1971 General Motors flow-through ventilation system. And in 1971 and 1971 only, you'll notice that almost all General Motors vehicles had louvers on the deck lid. And this was, well, a good idea in practice. GM got rid of the vent panes where you could ash your cigarette out them and get a little bit of ventilation with the broader window closed, and instead had the cabin air come out of the trunk and out of these deck lid louvers. And again, it was a good idea. It basically allowed air to come in through the cowl into the passenger compartment, go through the back seat into the trunk, and then come out the deck lid. This is also, I can tell you, an early 1971 model because it has quite a few louvers on the deck lid. As the model year would go on, the number of louvers would reduce, and by 1972, almost none of the GM vehicles, except for really the Vega, would have those louvers on the deck lid. I guess what General Motors found was that in some cases, the exhaust was backdrafting into the car and asphyxiating people. So, well, the louvers went bye-bye. But as I said, this is an early 1971 model. You can tell by the number of louvers. You'll see later 1971s have fewer louvers before they disappeared entirely for the 1972 model year. Now let's turn to the inside of this Grand Ville, and you'll see that this particular 71 Grand Ville actually has an optional custom interior. There were two interiors that were available. This is the higher end one. And one of the things that you got when you got the higher end custom interior were these buttons on the seats, as well as cigarette lighters in the seat backs. You can see it there on the driver's side. There's also one on the passenger side. The extremely astute observer will note that that is the wrong cigarette lighter. It's supposed to be a chrome finished cigarette lighter, but it looks like the individual who owns this car has placed the normal ashtray cigarette lighter into that particular receptacle. So tisk tisk, that will be a few points deducted at the car show. But you'll also notice that this car is fully loaded, at least in terms of interior options. Has that custom interior, has the rear defogger, not a defroster. It has the defogger that'll blow air on the back window, unheated air. And again, the purpose is really to defog it if there's just some stale air in the cabin. You can also see by the two switches on the door panel that it has both power windows as well as power locks. Now, unfortunately, somebody has added an aftermarket stereo or something to this car. I don't know why people have to have their tunes in their vehicle, but that is, I guess, just a pet peeve of mine. Listen to the beautiful rumble of, in this case, the 455 cubic inch Pontiac V8 that makes 325 horsepower. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, as opposed to enjoying, some tunes. And here we have a view of the driver's door panel and the driver's seat. You can see that there are the four power window switches at the front of the door panel, then the power lock switch behind that. This also has the remote exterior mirror control and a power seat. And notice the steering column is a tilt steering column. So this person has all of the goodies on their Grand Ville. Now in 1971, the interiors were all new and they went to this revised dash design that has kind of a driver-centric look to it, and two round pods, one for the speedometer and one for the gauges, at least a fuel gauge. The remainder were idiot lights unless you paid for the optional rally gauge package. You just got lights for oil, the brake, and then the temperature. But overall, just a luxurious place to be in the 71 Grand Ville. And here is that cigarette lighter in the seat back. You'll notice that the actual lighter itself says lighter on it, and that is incorrect. This should be a chrome lighter in the seat back. That lighter that you see here is actually the one that goes under the dash, the main cigarette lighter. So I guess whoever owned this, well, they just perhaps lost the lighters there and then they replaced it with these. Here is also a picture of the rear defogger. Again, this was just a blower style defogger that would blow air on the back window. Later, the defroster, the electric defroster would come in, and that would actually heat the rear window and help clear it of ice as well as fog. A much better setup than this thing that just blew some lukewarm air across the back window. And here's the heart of the beast, Pontiac's 455 cubic inch V8, making 325 gross horsepower and I think 235 net horsepower. The difference being that the gross horsepower rating was calculated absent the air cleaner and the accessories and the exhaust system. The net horsepower rating had all of those on it. So this was the top of the line Pontiac engine for 1971, and unfortunately in 1971, Pontiac went to a low compression engine, as did all of General Motors, including Corvettes, had low compression engines that could run on unleaded fuel. So the compression ratios being north of 10-1, well, those were gone, and you got this 8-1 compression ratio, 455, but it was still peppy and still powerful, especially if you added dual exhaust. This car came standard with single exhaust. If you had a dual exhaust, you got about another 25 net horsepower. Nothing to sneeze at. And I'll say, as the owner of a 71 Grand Ville, when I put dual exhaust on mine, it felt considerably peppier. So if you have one of these big block GM vehicles from this era, I would definitely recommend putting dual exhaust on it. You're going to pick up 25-ish horsepower, and you'll do it for a relatively cheap price, and you'll get an exhaust system that, well, sounds good. Now, just a few other points I'll mention for the car collector who may not be familiar with General Motors V8s of this time, but every General Motors division had its own V8 engines. And so a Pontiac 455 is completely different from an Oldsmobile 455, completely different from a Buick 455, completely different from a Chevrolet 454, and a Cadillac 472 or 500, at least during this time frame. They did share basically some super minor components like a carburetor and some ignition components, and that was it. The actual engines themselves were designed to be entirely different. And as a result, the cars do drive differently. These V8s have different characters to them. I will say that my 71 Grand Ville, when I first got it, it had its single exhaust on it. Really didn't have much top end, tons of torque, but it was kind of wheezy, I would say, at the upper end. The second that I put dual exhaust on it, though, the engine, it was like it came alive, and it just pulls and pulls and pulls, especially if you flip the air cleaner over, kind of the old school trick, and let the carburetor suck in all of the air that it wants. It's actually a pretty fast car in that regard. These Grand Villes came standard with a 3.08-1 rear end, which was a relatively short rear end for a full-size car with a 455. Most GM vehicles had a 273 rear end, these big cars with big block engines. Some, like the Buicks, even had a 256 rear end, so very tall. This was a relatively short rear end for the time, and I got to say, the car is peppy. Now, the downside of that is that if you drive the car on the freeway or even around town, a lot of these GM vehicles with the taller rear ends, like my 70 Electra, would get 18 miles per gallon on the freeway, which frankly I think is amazing. But my Grand Ville is one of my slurpers. It doesn't matter how I drive it. It just gets, like on the freeway, I would say 11, maybe 12. I would say mostly 11 miles per gallon. Pretty bad. It's a big difference between 11 versus 18 miles per gallon. But that's what happens when you got an engine that's turning faster. In any case, this Grand Ville is, a special car, especially because it's from Canada. and it's a fully loaded example, I really am hesitating to see that it's missing any options between the power locks, power windows, tilt wheel, custom interior, air conditioning. It's a pretty loaded car, cornering lights, and a great looker. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this particular vehicle. Thanks again for watching.